Hello, and thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I'm David Pendergrass. Today I'm very excited to have a preeminent New Testament scholar, Professor Larry Hurtado. I'm so glad to have him on here. If you've listened to my podcast before, you've heard me recommend Professor Hurtado's work for some time. His scholarship is long as it is wide for many decades now, and the last few years, I believe you started there. I don't know exactly when it started, but a blog that I also recommend to people that I think is quite accessible for the layperson, but also for the scholar, but certainly for the layperson. And I always recommend your work. So Dr. Hurtado, Professor Hurtado, I appreciate you taking the time to be on my podcast today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here to talk about things.
Very briefly, just for some biographical information, I think on your Wikipedia page, it says you're from Kansas City. Is that right?
Yes, I was born and brought up in the greater Kansas City area, and lived in the States until 1975, and then moved to Canada to take up a teaching post after PhD work. I was in Vancouver for 3 years, and then moved to Winnipeg, where I was at the University of Manitoba for 18 years, and then moved to Edinburgh in 1996 to take the chair of New Testament here.
Wow, okay. Where did you do your PhD work?
At Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland.
In Cleveland, okay. All right, great. Obviously, there's a lot of things we could talk about, but first I want to start with some of your most recent work. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about your latest works, like why on earth did anyone become a Christian in the first 3 centuries, and I think the most recent work you've done is Destroyer of the Gods. You talk to us a little bit about what the theses are and the arguments you've made in those books.
Well, the slightly earlier one that came out in the spring, Why on Earth Did Anyone Become a Christian in the First 3 Centuries, is an enlarged version of a lecture that I was asked to give at Marquette University in the Marquette Lecture Series. And so that small book is an expanded version of that lecture in which I explore the question posed in the title. One of the things I'm trying to do there is to emphasize what was at stake for people in the first 2 or 3 centuries in becoming a Christian, how costly it was socially and even politically. Uniquely so, it seems, in the ancient world, uniquely in becoming a Christian. And so the question then becomes, okay, why did people pay the price? Why were they willing to suffer the social and political consequences? What did they think they were getting, on the assumption that people tend to make what they regard as good decisions, based on some kind of rational basis. They obviously must have felt that they were getting something through Christian faith that they could not so readily get elsewhere. Now, I have to say that the purpose of that lecture was more to push the question, which I think has not been done justice, even by scholars, rather than to provide some definitive answers. So don't feel cheated if you read the book and you think, at the end, I've only given some tentative answers. As I say at the outset, my purpose is not to give a definitive answer, but to highlight the question and to get people to realize how important it is. The other book, which was being written just about the same time and which came out in August, I think, is called Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. And the purpose of that book is, as the subtitle indicates, to indicate how early Christianity was distinctive, both distinctive from modern versions of it, but also very distinctive among the religious options of the time. Indeed, distinctive is a mild way of putting it. In the eyes of many observers of the time, it was bizarre, even dangerous, and regarded as something that was a threat to the religious system of the day. So I'm trying to emphasize several specific ways in which early Christianity was perceived as socially unacceptable, religiously dangerous in its time. The other point that I'm making, though, is that those distinctive features that I highlight have now long since become for us unexamined assumptions that we take for granted, particularly about religion. But actually to say, yes, but these things that you take for granted are actually rather bizarre ideas in the history of the world, and they stem largely from the influence of Christianity.
And if you don't mind saying a little bit, what were some of those bizarre features, and of course, why were they considered dangerous to the ancient Greeks and Romans?
Well, one thing to keep in mind at the outset is that we're talking about not a conflict between religion and irreligion. As if early Christianity was religious and the Roman world was irreligious or secular, but instead a conflict of what was regarded as a bizarre and unacceptable kind of religion in a deeply, profoundly religious society. For example, one of the accusations hurled against early Christianity was that it was a form of atheism. Mm-hmm. It was impiety. What was objectionable about Christianity was not, the kind of objection you get now, maybe in the modern country club. Oh, you're one of those religious geeks. We're not. Right, but rather, oh, you're a really weird, unacceptable kind of religion amongst us very religious, deeply traditional religious people. It was that kind of conflict. Christians didn't honor the gods. Mm. They were not supposed to, by their own teaching, they were not supposed to honor and worship the pantheon of gods of the Roman world. Mm-hmm. And in that society, the gods were everywhere. They undergirded and justified every aspect of social and political existence. Mm-hmm. Dinner parties, trade union guilds, or the equivalent, social clubs, city councils, on up to the level of the empire. At every level, the justification and the meaning of that structure rested upon the gods. And the early Christians were expected to say, these gods are rubbish and are not worth being reverenced at all. They're invalid. That called into question, in the eyes of people, that called into question the legitimacy of all of these structures that based themselves on the gods. Mm-hmm. And so Christians were seen to be socially seditious. This is the kind of charge hurled against them, that they could destroy the society, destroy the family, because it was simply believed that the integrity, the durability, and the legitimacy of all social structures, from family right on up to empire, rested upon these gods. Mm-hmm. So one of the unexamined assumptions I point out in the opening of that chapter is if we were to go out into the street with a microphone and ask people, do you believe in God? They would probably give you an answer of yes, no, or I'm still making up my mind. The obvious prior question that nobody would ask probably is, wait a minute, which of the many gods are we talking about? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. As I say, in the West, even atheists assume that there's only one God to doubt. But that's a bizarre notion in the history of the world. And in the Roman world, Christians were regarded as bizarre because they worshipped only their own God and refused to reverence the many gods of the larger Roman world. That's one example.
It's a great example. I think about in today's world how many times the so-called new atheists and others, and also just, you might say the typical internet atheist infidel, as they're sometimes called, which may not be the best title, but anyway, they will often make the accusation now when Christians do talk about God, and certainly in debates, they'll say, well, I don't believe in Zeus, and I don't believe in this and this. So there's a little more discussion these days amongst atheists to talk about the gods they don't believe in, which even in of itself, as I've talked to people and atheists and skeptics, and of course even to Christians, to encourage them and equip them, is to say that they still, I don't want to say this, that in the ancient world, it's hard to meet a genuine atheist, right? I mean, because almost anyone in Greek, Roman, Egyptian, it's quite a minority to find anyone who doesn't believe in some kind of higher power, whether it be even the Stoics, but certainly a personal God. Would you say more about that in the ancient world, about their notion of what we might call genuine atheism? Well, today, a lot of times atheists say, I'm an atheist and that I don't believe a God exists, versus the etymology of the word, that no God exists. Will you say a little about in the ancient world, that concept of whether or not any God exists, that exists, was that a common idea? And then secondly, how do we relate that to today's world if we're talking to a modern day atheist and we're trying to explain the bizarre qualities of Christianity?
Well, it was hard in the ancient world. It was hard to find somebody who would quite openly express doubt about the existence of all the gods. You do have some philosophical figures who come pretty doggone close to that, but they didn't go out into the street or organize a social movement to that effect. They held it as more of a private belief or teaching that they might share among their students, but that's about it. More commonly, the point is that whether you whether you expressed a belief in the existence of the gods or not was not primarily the thing that people wanted, the primary expression of religion. The primary expression of religion was to offer sacrifice and to participate in the worship of the gods. Mm-hmm. That's how you signaled an acceptance of the gods or not, was whether you participated in the worship of the gods. And so even those philosophers who engaged in questions like, what are the gods really after all? Are they simply glorified ancestors? Are they mythical figures? What are they really? Even those who kind of did the sort of daring questions about the nature of the gods and whether they existed, still, basically, when it came time to participate in the sacrifices to the gods, did so. They might harbor private doubts or beliefs, but they didn't break with the social conventions of worshiping them. That's where the rubber hit the road. Mm-hmm. And early Christians didn't spend their time primarily arguing philosophical issues over whether the gods existed. Mm-hmm. They simply said, we don't reverence them, we don't accept them as valid, and we will not participate in worshiping them. That was the issue. Worship was the crucial expression of religion in the ancient world. And so to be an atheist in that society meant primarily you did not participate in the worship of the gods. And since worship was the basic way that you affirmed a god's reality, yes, to refuse to worship deities was effectively to refuse to acknowledge their reality, or at least a refusal to acknowledge their validity as gods. Right, sometimes Jews and ancient Christians, for example, said, oh, yes, there are beings. These gods are beings, but they are invalid beings. Sometimes, for example, they're demons. Right. As in St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He says, I wouldn't want you to worship these idols because they're demons. Right. They're invalid beings. They're evil beings. So it wasn't so much the existence of beings, it was the validity, their validity as recipients of worship that was the key issue.
And I want to talk, thank you, and I want to talk more about that sense as it relates to monotheism in a moment. But if I go back, I think about these two concepts, your two works, Why on Earth Did Anyone Become a Christian, and then The Destroyer of the Gods. I was thinking about how these relate, and I'm sure they relate in your mind as well, how it's costly to become a Christian, and asking the question, why do they pay the price, mixed with it's very distinctive and bizarre. I'm trying to relate that to maybe a modern-day Christian today. What are some things perhaps we can relate these to I know it's a mouthful, but the average Christian today who's trying to be a disciple of Jesus? So we can't really relate to the idea that in the ancient world, most people believed in a god or gods, and so they didn't have the same kind of debate or struggle or discussion today as now we have people who don't believe in any gods whatsoever, or people who, we still have pluralism in whether the Hindu culture and so forth, but also those who don't believe in any kind of deity. But I'm wondering, how would you encourage people today? I think you are a Christian, right, Professor?
Yes, I'm guilty.
Yeah, you're very dangerous and bizarre.
Take me to the lambs.
Take me to the lambs, amen. So what would you say to those people today who, from your work, and of course your work over decades, but particularly these two particular works you're talking about right now, what are some things maybe a Christian can use from that to help them and buttress them in their daily conversations, or maybe their own doubt or skepticism? How would you encourage them from your works? What are some nuggets we can take from your works?
Well, I think one of the things I would, although I dearly hope that people buy my books,
and me too,
and perhaps even read them, but certainly buy them. But seriously, I would also really want people to read some of the works of ancient Christians on whom I draw in the books that I've written. I mean, I think that reading some of these Christian writings from 2nd century, 3rd century Christians may very well read their New Testament writings, and that's well and good, very important stuff. Mm-hmm. But actually also writings from subsequent Christians of the second, 3rd century, people like Justin Martyr. Mm-hmm. This little interesting text called the Epistle to Diognetus. Mm-hmm. Reading again Tertullian's Apology or Defense of Christianity, written about 200 or so. Mm-hmm. Various writings of this time. You're reading firsthand. I would encourage Christians to read those texts. I think they'll be inspired by seeing how these early Christians faced up to the challenges of their time. It's not a one-for-one exact replication of our situation by any means, but you may be able to draw some more general lessons in learning how those Christians attempted to both commend themselves to their society and try to avoid unnecessary offense, while also being quite clear to the non-negotiable distinctives that they had to maintain.
Gotcha. So maybe learning from their example of how they defended their faith.
Yes, and I think both things are important. The early Christians, even in texts like 1 Peter in the New Testament, as I read it, the author there, as in Epistle to Diognetus and others, and this is a characteristic stance of Christians, they're basically saying, no, for example, they were encouraged to pray for the emperor and to pray for the empire and for the welfare of their cities. These are pagan cities, a pagan emperor who in many cases is persecuting them, or at least is treating them with disdain and giving them no time. But they're told, no, they should pray for these figures, not pray that they become Christians necessarily, but pray for their survival, pray for their welfare, pray that they will rule justly, and that sort of thing. So in every way they're trying to participate as loyal citizens in a society that treats them with hostility. There's something to be learned there. And also, at the same time, maintaining a balance between that and saying, but on certain things we can't compromise. Certain things that we must maintain the integrity of our faith in. But doing so in as loving and as winsome a way, or at least as ineffective a way, as they possibly could. There are lessons to be learned there, I think, in our society. You're maybe in a Western society like the United States or like Britain, increasingly secular and non-religious, at least in many circles. So, one of the ways that you can sort of bring conversation to a halt at a smart dinner party is by admitting that you're a Christian.
Right.
You can admit to being almost anything else, an ex-con, a drug addict, whatever, and people will say, oh, that's very nice, could you please pass me the wine?
That's right.
But if you admit to being a Christian, you probably note an audible intake of breath and a sudden curious stillness in the conversation.
That's right.
So one of the questions there is, okay, how do you handle that? Do you want to avoid being stupid for stupid's sake? You want to avoid being offensive just to be odd or geeky, but you want to commend yourself and try to make yourself seem as reasonable as you can for the sake of your faith as well as your own social life. But also, how do you articulate in a careful and as inoffensive a way as you can what it is that you believe and why you do or do not do certain things. Similarly, our societies are becoming increasingly pluralistic. At one time, maybe there were two choices. You were either a Christian or you were, the village atheist. Nowadays, of course, your neighbor on your left is perhaps a Buddhist, the neighbor on your right is perhaps Muslim, the neighbor across the street is perhaps Hindu, and behind you is a Jewish friend, and, umpteen different kinds of Christians left, right, and center. And so this is a very pluralized society with various versions of religion. How do you articulate and maintain and affirm the distinctiveness, the particularities of Christian faith, for example, without simply mindlessly assimilating it and giving over distinctives to some sort of vague general religiousness that blurs all the differences, and yet maintain those distinctives in a way that is, shall we say, I use the word again, that is winsome, if possible, or at least causes curiosity in the minds of people who may have a very different kind of religious faith, giving you the opportunity to say why you are what you are.
On that issue, if someone were to ask you at that dinner, well, first I want to say, of course, I completely agree. I lived in Houston for about 10 years, and I was, as you're describing, a Hindu on the left side and Buddhist and Jew and so forth. My family, we lived on the street that was, the UN. I mean, we had Hindus and people straight from Africa and Mexico. We had Buddhists and Jews all on the same street, and we had Asians that were, on and on. We had all kinds of different backgrounds and faiths, and we were constantly reminded as we just drove down the road, whether there be a funeral procession, whether it be a religious holiday for them, we're always reminded. So we had as many conversations as we could with people, not to mention just, you might say, not native, but we had people who were just normal, I guess, the average Americans, but they themselves didn't go to church, and so we had interesting religious conversations, but we were always reminded that there's a distinction. But if someone asked you, Professor, if someone said at that dinner table, okay, so I heard you're a Christian, you're guilty, and I guess even briefly, if someone said, why are you a Christian? What would you say?
Well, I think I would say I found myself, and still find myself, in my language, haunted by the love of God, and the love of God particularly as expressed in Christ. And I think I would have to deny something very real and very moving and meaningful for me in order to deny my faith. That's not to say there aren't circumstances in which that could well happen. I'm not that brave. And I admire the way people down through the ages have sometimes endured severe persecution or even torture. But were I put in a situation and forced to do that, I would feel that I betrayed something that was so essential to the way I saw the world and the way I lived that I would be betraying myself as well. So I find the gospel message of God's redeeming love in Christ to be so powerful that it draws me in an irresistible kind of way.
Well, thank you. That's interesting. Irresistible kind of way. I would love maybe another time, if you'd be willing, I'd love to have some other questions about your understanding then of atonement and the significance of the death of Jesus. It makes me think of Tom Wright's recent book, The Day the Revolution Began, which I'm now using actually as studies in my church, but that'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. But if I'll go back to as it relates to your literature, so then, very briefly, why do you think Christianity spread the way it did if it was so costly? And I know, like I said, you didn't give any definitive answers, but just even in general, why do you think it spread the way it did if it had so much, I don't know, it was at risk? They had their lives, their social, their friendships, their economies. I mean, why did they do it? Why do you think they did it?
Yes, I have some tentative thoughts, but seriously, the Mark lecture was intended to try to formulate and put the question forth in as explicit a way as I can, because I don't think that I have all the answers, and I think that it is worth spending a lot more time collegial among scholars in trying to address the question. People have written on why did early Christianity grow collectively. Right. That's been done, from the 19th century at least onward, and various reasons have been given. The great Adolf Harnack and his mission and expansion of Christianity, and on down to the present. So people say, well, early Christianity grew but a lot of the reasons for this are reasons that don't take account of the negative consequences of being a Christian. Why did Christianity grow? Well, because it offered people a chance to get together and have, what anthropologists would call a fictive family of brothers and sisters and bonding and so on. And you go, yeah, but so everything we know about the ancient Roman world tells us there were at least 50 other opportunities to have the same sort of close-knit family-like associations at the same time. Various collegia, burial societies, various other social groups, including various other religious groups who likewise used language of brother, sister, close bonding kind of thing. So you could find yourself a fellowship group if that's what you wanted on any corner of any Roman street, so to speak. None of the others would require you to forsake the worship of your family gods, your city gods, or get you into trouble with your family, your city, or the empire. None of them. Christianity, uniquely, if you were a conscientious convert to Christianity, you were expected to cease participating in the worship of your family. If you're a typical kind of pagan background, you would have household gods. There would be city gods. There would be gods of your nation, and of course gods of the empire. Rome itself. The goddess Roma personified in that goddess. You were expected to eschew all of these deities, which automatically put you into a tension from your family on through all of your other associations. And we know that from the references in New Testament early Christian writings, kind of social harassment and ostracism and even sort of petty violence that families and neighbors inflicted upon Christians. So since you could get, for example, as they say, a nice, close, touchy-feely bonding from any number of other groups, why on earth would you join Christianity? Okay, they say, well, Christianity had a belief in a high, exalted picture of their God. Yeah, so did lots of philosophical circles. You could join a philosophical circle if all you wanted to do was to have lofty, exalted thoughts about a deity distant and far away. So again and again, most of the answers that have been given for why Christianity grew, it seems to me, have been banal, and I think not terribly impressive, precisely because they haven't taken account of the social costs involved. So we need to frame the question, not simply say, why did Christianity grow, but in the words of my book, why on earth did anybody become a Christian, given the social costs involved? Now, I think that there are some things we can point to.
Right.
Probably different factors for different people. One of the things that I've suggested, for example, I happen to have noticed, is that it's very difficult in pagan literature of the time, religious literature of the time, to find references to God's loving people, loving people. You find references to the gods as being generous in some cases, or bountiful, or kindly disposed, or nice things like that.
Right.
But the New Testament, for example, is full on practically every page of picturing a God who is who expresses a powerful love for the world, such that, in the language of the New Testament, he gave up his only son, or whatever. It's a love that that is the motivation behind the biblical God's whole relationship with the world. There's nothing like that in the pagan discourse of the time. Now, maybe, my thought is, maybe for some people, that was a very attractive thing. That was a very startling, in some sense, but attractive thing. Imagine, the proclamation is, there is actually only one God. All of these other gods are rubbish. There's actually only one God who is uniquely known through the biblical material, and this God rules over everything, judges over everything, is all-powerful, almighty. That's a pretty scary kind of figure to think about. A God who can do anything is a pretty scary thing. In the polytheistic world, you may have a God who's on your case, but you can turn to other gods to help defend you. So, you can play off God against the other. But if there's only one God in town, only one God who's sort of the chairman of the board and who everything else is under him, that can be a pretty scary prospect. But then to be told, but this one all-powerful God is a God of enormous and powerful love for the world. That may have been a powerful ingredient for some people. We know from people like Justin Martyr, who gives a kind of confession of his own conversion, also that for many people probably the fact that Christians were able to articulate their faith in a clear and an impressive kind of way for some people was meaningful. So for some people it was heavily, the intellectual quality of Christian faith, that Christians were able to criticize pagan religion cogently, using philosophical traditions of the time to criticize pagan philosophy and religion, sort of turning their own weapons against them, and also articulating a view of God and of Jesus and of Christian and of what this God was and what kind of life this God wanted us to live. Doing that in such a way that I think it was probably very impressive and very attractive for some people who thought, wow, that there's a sense in which you see, it seems to me, there's a sense in which faith, Christian faith, is, I'll put it this way, is a wish that it be so. You can't prove faith by hauling it out the way you would empirically, a scientific experiment. Faith is faith. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, says Hebrews. You can't really demonstrate it empirically. So there's an element in which endorsing Christian faith is to say, that is so attractive, that is so meaningful, that I want that to be so, and I will gamble my life that it is. And I think for some people, the effectiveness in early Christian exponents of Christianity was intellectually attractive for them. And for other people, the moral quality of Christian lives, we know, was effective. Christians didn't abandon their children. They didn't commit infanticide, which is a common practice, common way of birth control. They didn't participate in black support. They didn't spend their money in brothels. They didn't gamble away money. They were faithful to their wives and expected their men to be as chaste as most people expected wives to be. That would have been doggone impressive to some people, I think, as well. Perhaps particularly women might have been attracted because Christianity expected men to live, as they say, the same kind of chaste sexual lives as most people expected women of the day to live. That, it seems to me, is one of the essential differences between Christianity on sexual matters, is that everybody in the ancient world expected an honorable woman to live in a chaste kind of way to her husband. Early Christianity said, yes, and we expect our men to live the same way. That was the revolutionary sexual thing. Early Christianity erased the double standard. And I think for some people that would have been attractive. So different factors for different people. But I don't think we've put it all together yet. In particular, we haven't put it together in the context of what the downside of being a Christian was.
Yeah. That's really good. Those are really, of course, really good points. I think back in my dissertation, I did a lot of work in the apologist, the early Christian, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century apologist. And something I personally was just bothered at, just my own preference. They didn't ask my opinion, but I remember thinking they rarely mention the resurrection. Rarely. It's not a typical, of course, the typical argument from antiquity. This goes back even to Moses, who beats your philosophers and so forth. But I always was so influenced by 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's argument, or at least the assumption that if the resurrection didn't happen, we were to be pitied and our faith is in vain. I always wanted the early apologists to say, wait a second, if Jesus was raised from the dead, that's enough. We don't need to make an argument from antiquity. We don't need to argue that we're moral. We don't need to argue all these things because it really happened. It's true. And then secondly, of course, I've always been so influenced by the New Testament assumption, and I know you've argued this in your works as well, that they really believed they were experiencing the Spirit. They had a religious experience that drove them to have these convictions. And I've always been surprised by that. What do you, and I'll move on to something quickly here, but what do you make of the fact that they don't mention the resurrection that much, and they say other things, like what you've said, the moral issues and other kinds of arguments? Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think that when the early Christians, particularly in the 2nd, 3rd century, are attempting to make their defenses of Christianity, the Latin word apologia, or the Greek word apologia, their defenses of Christianity, they're usually trying, as they say, to defend Christianity on terms that would be understandable to the non-Christian. So, for example, one of the other things they don't do, if you look at someone like Justin Martyr, compare his apology with his other big work, the dialogue with Trypho the Jew.
Right,
in the dialogue with Trypho the Jew, where the argument is over whether Jesus really is the Messiah of Jewish hope or not, it's full of biblical citations. They're arguing the Bible back and forth and throwing scriptural texts at each other on practically every page. When you read his apology, you don't see citations of the Bible. You don't see citations of biblical prophecy, generally. Instead, because the pagan of the time would go, so what is this text, Zechariah? What says what? Who cares? What the devil is that? And so they use concepts, arguments that they hope will be understandable and acceptable, in a sense, on the bases that pagans themselves would recognize. And resurrection, of course, as you will know, is a dodgy sort of notion for people in the ancient world. Not only is it almost incomprehensible, but for many, many people at the time, it's utterly repugnant. Who would want to be brought back into a bodily existence? What the devil is wrong with you? That's weird. You want to go to the land of happy spirits across the river Styx, or however you imagine it, where you can live in an immaterial and therefore much more divine-like existence. To be embodied is going the wrong direction. Now, I think that's part of the reason, therefore, why people say if you introduced resurrection, that would almost be like a distraction to the main point, which is to say, what kind of God is it we're talking about? Why don't you worship the gods? Why do you refuse to honor the gods? Why do you live the way you do? And so on. So they were really trying to defend Christian existence, and amongst themselves, in their commentaries and their preaching and so on, they do talk about them. And the creedal formulations, they do confess Jesus' resurrection is absolutely crucial.
Sure.
But it wasn't something, I think, that works so well with outsiders.
I have to think more about what you just said and how, I guess I've never really thought too much about how that might have hurt their cause by mentioning the resurrection. I consider that more. If I might change gears, you've worked a lot about, in your works, you've worked much on the concept of the earliest burst of Christianity on the scene and their worship and their devotion to Jesus alone. And as you know, the term monotheism is controversial in biblical studies, not only because it's anachronistic, that is, of course, people didn't use that term, as far as I can tell, before about the 17th century. And for our listener, monotheism just means, of course, the belief that there is only one God. So that's problematic in biblical studies, but because in addition to that, there were various ways that Jews understood exactly what it meant to say the term God. I'm just setting context here. Like Richard Bauckham, for example, a fine British scholar, he's in his seminal essays and now his books, he talks about God, and God may have a divine identity. And to be in the divine identity, you had to at minimum be able to create and judge. And so Bauckham and other scholars make a hard line between God as above and every other being is below, angels and everything. You didn't have a semi-divine figure or a semi-divine agent. I know that's also debated. But so granting it's anachronistic to use the term monotheism, whether you use that term or not in your response, but could you talk to me a little bit about how Jews in the first century understood God?
Well, there are two things. Again, religion in the ancient world, not just pagan religion, but Jewish religion, Christian religion, all forms of religiousness in the ancient world was expressed and defined primarily in worship practice. Of course, there are beliefs, implicit and in many cases explicit religious beliefs. I mean, for example, you have to implicitly presume that the gods exist in order to offer them worship, generally. And in the case of Judaism and Christianity, religious beliefs are often much more explicit precisely because they're distinguishing themselves from the larger religious environment. So certainly religious beliefs and doctrines, you might say, are a factor. But the key identifying feature that made what religion was and that distinguished one form of religiousness from another was who you worshiped and how you worshiped. And the key way that Jews were distinguished in the ancient world and Jews and their God was that they insisted only their one deity of the biblical deity was to receive worship, and that all other beings were illegitimate recipients of sacrifice and worship. They, as they say, they also articulated explicitly some of their beliefs as to who this God is, and they described him as Bauckham has pointed out, as the universal creator, created all things, and in their view, even the angels, demons, all sorts of other beings, everything that you could imagine, ultimately created by this one God. And that this one God is the ruler over all things. So unlike, let's say, the kind of Zoroastrian notion of there being a God who rules over, a good God who rules over part of the world, a bad God over against him, there is no bad God. There's only the one God who rules over all things. And so there were these key beliefs, and for them that is characteristic of who this deity is. Of course, also this deity is, for Jews, is identified very explicitly as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the biblical narratives, the God of the biblical tradition, who has chosen Israel to be his people and to be a light to the world, and so on. So that this is the way they articulate and express their exclusive devotion to this one God. I think Bauckham is correct in saying that Jews defined their God primarily in terms of his attributes, creator of all things, ruler of all things, judge of all things. They didn't usually draw upon Greek philosophical categories, of divine essence or divine being. Instead, they talked about what God did and does that distinguishes this God from all the other beings.
So, what do you do with the fact that early Christian devotion had, as you call, binary or triadic devotional pattern to Jesus? I'm curious how controversial that would have been. If I'm the Apostle Paul and I say like 1 Corinthians 8:6, and I put in Jesus into this Shema, how controversial is that? Are they going to, in your perspective, do they have a fit over this? Are they prepared? Because later on in Christian Trinitarian development, and we all know that they eventually started putting categories. You had God's the Father and His Word and then His Spirit. And so you have some kind of three pattern there in the biblical text. But I'm curious if you'll say something about that and your work that you've done on this early Christian devotion, and as it relates to their concept of there's no. Well, first off, I should ask the question: do you agree that there is no semi-divine agent or figure? If that's true, then what do you do with the fact that Jesus is all of a sudden worshipped?
Well, I think I would put it a different way.
Okay.
I think I know what Bauckham is trying to argue against there. But if we just go by the language that ancient Jews used in biblical material and elsewhere, they're quite free in talking about beings, other beings, right. and even in referring to other beings as gods. I mean, that's in the
right.
Psalm 80, Psalm 82, and various other psalms which refer to God, the God of the Bible, exalted above all gods.
Right.
And one of the terms that is used for angelic beings in some of the texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran, is to talk about the gods. And what they mean are the heavenly beings that we usually refer to as angels, but they can, in old poetic language, be called Elim, in Hebrew, gods.
Right.
So they use this language. So if you say, well, okay, if they use the language of gods, then they must have thought of them being semi-divine beings. I mean by that, they're heavenly beings, they're divine in some kind of way, but the emphatic point is, whatever they are not in the same genus, you might say, in the same
right.
category as the one biblical deity, and they are not to be worshipped, they're not to be confused with the one God, the one true God who created all things. Because, among other things, all of these other gods, all of these other angelic beings, heavenly beings, are ultimately seen as creatures of the one God.
Right. Right.
So they're not divine in the way God is. They're not human. So what do we call them? Well, I don't know, semi-divine.
Right.
So there are different categories of divinity, you might say, or heavenly beings. But the crucial thing is, how do you know the difference? Well, you know the difference because this one deity is to be worshipped. So, for example, in some of the Jewish mystical texts of the time, where it pictures somebody kind of, going through a kind of mystical ascent up into the heavens where he encounters all these heavenly beings in his imagination. And characteristic of what will happen is he goes up into heavens and he sees all these angelic, powerful beings and he goes, wow, look at that, or words to that effect, man, all these powerful, divine-like beings. And then what he notices is that when he comes in the presence of the one true God, all of these other beings bow down and worship the one upon the throne. Similar to what goes on in the book of Revelation, where the guy goes up into heaven, sees all sorts of enthroned and crowned and heavenly beings. But when the throne of God appears, everybody bows down and gives worship to the one God. So that's the crucial distinction, it seems to me, that they insisted upon. Therefore, when the early Christians modified it, and when I say early Christians, I mean the early circles of Jewish believers in Jesus before they were called Christians. So when the earliest circles of what we may call the Jesus movement, after Jesus' death and resurrection experiences, when these early circles of the Jesus movement begin to treat Jesus in ways in which otherwise only God is to be treated, that was what I've referred to from the 1980s onward as a major mutation in Jewish religious practice, devotional practice, giving it a distinctive, dyadic shape in which God is worshipped and Jesus, believed to be exalted at God's right hand, is enfolded or incorporated into the kind of devotional practices that are otherwise reserved for God alone. So yes, I think that was a major, in historical terms, that is a major and apparently, again, distinctive innovation. We don't really have evidence of any other Jewish group of the time whose devotional practice involves giving the same kind of devotional gestures, singing hymns. You know, for example, we know in the early church that people pray to Jesus, that they sing hymns to Jesus, that they baptize. You are converted and baptized, invoking the name of Jesus over the person. The common meal that they celebrate is, as Paul describes it, a meal at which Jesus is the presiding figure, so to speak, like a deity sitting at the table, and it's the table of the Lord, which he likens. He likens and contrasts to the pagan meals, where the pagan deities are believed to be present. And so he says, no, the Lord's Supper, the Lord Jesus is present, so you can't participate in these other meals. So, in a variety of ways that I've illustrated repeatedly since the 1980s, a whole constellation of quite specific devotional practices that are regular, that are characteristic, and that are public and corporately engaged in. They are identifying marks of Christian devotional practice. They comprise this distinctive dyadic shape with two figures. And we have no other comparable pattern of devotion that I've been able to find anywhere in Second Temple Jewish texts. And in the larger Roman world. Because you either have multiple deities, oodles of deities to whom devotion is given, or you have this singular deity to whom devotion is given. And the early Jesus movement has this distinctive mutation in which you have a singular deity and his son Jesus, who are incorporated into it. All the while insisting that they are loyal to the one true God. But their conviction is this one true God has sent forth Jesus, raised him from the dead, exalted him to heavenly glory, conferred upon him the divine name, the divine throne, the divine glory, and now requires him to be reverenced along with God the Father. So that, in their view, to refuse to reverence Jesus is to disobey the one God. So it remains, in a sense, in our terms, it remains a monotheistic issue. That is, the emphasis on the uniqueness of the one God. But their argument is this one God now requires Jesus to be incorporated as well. He's been enthroned, like in 1 Corinthians 15. He's been exalted by the divine name, as in the Epistle to the Philippians, chapter 2. And so that every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess this Lord Jesus Christ to the glory of God the Father. So they would argue, no, there is not. We are not being untrue to our ancestral deity and our commitment to this one true God. He has now shown us that it is his will for us to reverence his unique Son as well. And so we are simply obeying him. And if you refuse to do so, they would say to fellow Jews perhaps, if you refuse to reverence this Jesus, you are actually blindly disobedient to your ancestral God.
Your hearts have been hardened. You have a veil over your face. Why
yes,
do you
and
think?
Obviously, it would have taken time in different locations, in different places, under different circumstances for people, let's say particularly, if I can use the term non-Jesus Jews, to perceive the significance of what was going on. And some would have seen this earlier than others. And of course, we must assume that the kind of devotional practices that characterized early Jesus circles may not have been uniform translocally, so people may have varied somewhat from here to there. So it didn't happen, like AD 35, all of a sudden all Jews woke up everywhere and thought, these people are nuts, let's go get them. It would have taken time, geographically and across time. However, I have argued repeatedly, and I stand by the argument, that for some perceptive Jews, such as Saul of Tarsus, the realization that the devotional practices of these particular Jews was highly objectionable and was endangering the religious integrity of the Jewish people, that realization may have come very early. I have suggested that part of the motivation, at least for the guy we know as Paul, Saul of Tarsus, to have attempted, in his words, to destroy the young Jesus movement, is precisely because he thought that they were in danger of committing a kind of idolatry and sacrilege in an inappropriate reverence of Jesus. And that would take us back to within the first year or two of the young Jesus movement. It's commonly thought that Saul underwent his own religious so-called conversion experience somewhere between 30 to 35 or so AD. So within the first 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years at most, already this devout, zealous Pharisee is judging the young Jesus movement to be dangerous for whatever reason, so dangerous that in his words, it needs to be destroyed.
Why do you think Psalm 110 became the dominant way to understand, right? He sits down to the right hand of the Father, his ascension, he's been given the name above all, Philippians 2 and so forth. Where do you think that came from? Because, of course, the belief that he's resurrected does not mean that he's ruling over. It does not mean he's received the name, which I would assume is an allusion to Yahweh. At least as far as my studies, I don't know why they would ever think that resurrection logically led to ruling over, and certainly not being part of the creation itself or the means through which creation came, 1 Corinthians 8:6. How do you think that developed? Why do you think they had that idea?
Well, I think that the earliest convictions that we can find in the aftermath of Jesus' crucifixion, the earliest convictions that erupt very quickly thereafter are that God has raised him from the dead and exalted him to heavenly glory. That is the two things, the resurrection of Jesus, that is the overcoming of the power of death, and the heavenly exaltation and glorification. It seems to me, in the earliest expressions of Christian convictions, these two things are inseparable. And the one and the other are connected. Now, as you say, it didn't have to be that way. After all, the Jewish, or a widespread Jewish expectation of the time was that all of the righteous, all of those who follow God and devout, would be raised from the dead at the end of time. So resurrection is given to all of the good, all of the elect, all of the righteous. So to say Jesus has been raised from the dead, so he was given this vindication that everyone expects at the end of time. Okay, that's interesting. He's been singled out ahead of the rest of us, but that's interesting. So resurrection by itself, as you quite rightly say, doesn't mean that you've been made the Lord of the universe.
Right.
But it's quite clear, it seems to me, that in the earliest expressions of Christian faith, they believe both things. They believe that he's been raised from the dead and, inseparably, been made Lord of the universe, exalted to God's right hand. So I think that they're, and the other thing we have to say is that, as you say, these convictions it's not easy to see how these convictions could have arisen from simply poring over the Old Testament text.
Right.
So I have argued for many years now, again from 1988 onward, that we have to allow for very, very powerful, in my terms, very powerful religious experiences, which struck the recipients with the force of revelation, and experiences in which they, in whatever mode, conveyed to them the powerful conviction that Jesus had not only been raised from the dead, but had been exalted to heavenly glory. Now, of course, we have the list of resurrection appearances that Paul recites in 1 Corinthians 15. He appeared to James, he appeared to Peter, he appeared to the 12, he appeared to me, and so on. So resurrection appearances, whatever they were, they had experiences in which they believed they encountered, in some kind of real way, the figure whom they knew to be the risen Jesus of Nazareth, the figure they knew and recognized. And yet also in a powerful, transformed, glorified existence. He's not brought back to mortal life, but brought forward, catapulted forward into a glorified existence, an immortal existence, and an immortal and glorified body in their view. So whatever they saw, whatever they experienced, however they came to that, it generated those convictions. So I think they probably had, among other things, visions of Christ exalted in heaven. The sort of thing, for example, that Revelation 4 and 5 talks about, the sort of thing that is attributed to Stephen in the book of Acts chapter 7, where he sees the heavens opened and he sees Jesus at the right hand of God. I think that probably the authors of these texts expected their readers not to go, "What? That's weird." But instead to go, "Oh yeah, we've heard that such things happen. My Uncle Harry had an experience like that," or something, I think that people had those kinds of experiences, which they understood to be confirmations of Jesus' heavenly glory. And also, I think that in some kind of combination with that, these Old Testament texts came in. So that text such as Psalm 110, sit at my right hand, or the text in Isaiah that is creatively dealt with in Philippians 2, every knee shall bow, every tongue shall give glory to the Lord. They read these suddenly. Under the impact of these experiences, these texts, I think, leapt off the page at them with a new kind of meaning. And sit at my right hand, which, of course, in Psalm 110 is simply an invitation to an earthly king to be enthroned. That's all it is. But when they read Psalm 110, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, they thought, yeah, and that means literally at God's right hand. Right. So they had experiences that they thought it took that text to a whole new level.
Whole new level.
And in that passage in Isaiah 45, they saw where it says, every knee shall bow and to God, and every tongue shall give praise to the Lord. Suddenly they read that, and they it seems to me they said to themselves, holy cow, look at that. There are two figures there. There's God and the Lord.
And the Lord.
Why didn't we see that before?
Right.
So it's the prior conviction, I think, arising from however you choose to understand it. So I think by powerful revelatory experiences, the powerful prior conviction that God has raised Jesus from the dead and given him heavenly glory, in the light of which they then read these biblical passages, trying to make sense of these experiences, trying to figure out what is happening. And they go back to their sacred texts, which they believe is predictive and guiding of God's truth. And in these biblical texts, they then find texts that help them to understand what the heck is going on, what God has really done.
I think that's by far the most compelling view. Especially the compelling view that experience led them to those beliefs, especially when we compare the way other Jews of the time period from the literature we have, which I know is somewhat scant, but when you look at the Targums and you look later on the Mishnah and Talmuds, when you realize that Jews, and even the Qumran material, that Jews in general did not use texts like Psalm 110 and some of these other texts to be quote-unquote messianic.
No,
so it's, what I'm saying, so it's unique or idiosyncratic.
No, I wrote a couple of essays in which I engaged the question of these Psalms, and for example, I cannot find in any of the indexes either that supply indexes of biblical references and allusions in Second Temple Jewish texts. I cannot find a single identifiable case where Psalm 110 is cited or alluded to in any alluded way in the entire body of Second Temple Jewish texts.
Right.
Now, obviously, Jews read the Psalms, and they must have read Psalm 110 along with all the other Psalms.
Right.
But it did not speak to them of anything messianic or in any other meaningful way.
Right.
And yet it is among the most frequently cited, most frequently alluded to texts in the New Testament.
Absolutely.
So
it needs to be explained. You have to explain any kind of story. We have to say, okay, why is that? And that's my point. I find that, like you just said, most compelling, because when you look at all these texts, it's very different to me. And Tom Wright makes a similar point when it comes to the resurrection. He said that if they were going to make up a story, they would say Jesus' body, he's a shining star. They would quote from Numbers or quote from Daniel, but they wouldn't say, we gave him fish or he's been resurrected. In other words, when you look at the text of the time period, it's bizarre that Jews didn't have those kinds of interpretations on their lips, or so to speak. It's bizarre. It's different.
On both sides, we have examples of biblical heroes who are taken up into heaven.
Right.
According to Jewish tradition, Enoch, the great figure from Genesis, is taken up into heaven. Moses, perhaps as well, taken up into heaven. Elijah, of course, in the famous heavenly chariot, taken up into heaven. So a kind of being taken up into heaven, in that sense, a heavenly exaltation by itself has biblical precedence. But none of these figures are taken up into heaven and installed as God's regent over the entire universe.
Right.
So it isn't just if they wanted to say Jesus has been vindicated, you may have done him in here, but God has taken him amongst his heavenly company of the elect. They had ways of saying that. That isn't what they're saying. They're saying that this figure has not only been vindicated by God, but has been installed as the Kyrios, the Lord of all of the universe, to whom now everything must give obeisance. That's a rather astonishing,
it is
and singular claim.
Okay, we're going to stop there, and I hope you'll pick back up with me on the podcast with my interview with Professor Larry Hurtado. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom. And also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom, or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways to reach out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.